The smirk appeared at exactly 9:47 a.m. Eastern, captured by C-SPAN Camera 2 in perfect focus. Senator Josh Hawley had just settled into his chair at the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on judicial nominations, his posture radiating the particular confidence of a man who believed he had already won an argument that hadn't started yet. He was scrolling through his phone with the casual dismissiveness of someone who had more important places to be, more important people to speak with, when the committee chair announced that Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas would be delivering testimony as a guest witness on matters of constitutional law and judicial accountability. Hawley's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He looked up from his phone. He looked directly at the camera, and he smiled, not a polite smile, not a collegial smile. The kind of smile that comes from a place of absolute certainty that the person about to speak has nothing of value to say. The kind of smile that carries decades of institutional assumptions about who belongs in certain rooms and who does not. The kind of smile that says, a first-term representative, a black woman from Texas with a background in civil rights law, is about to waste my time with talking points I've heard 1,000 times before. The smirk lingered for 3 full seconds before he leaned over to the senator beside him and whispered something that made them both chuckle. The microphones didn't catch the words, but they caught the tone. Dismissal, condescension. The absolute confidence of a Yale law graduate and former Supreme Court clerk that he was about to sit through an embarrassing amateur performance. What Josh Hawley did not know, what he could not have known as he returned to his phone and began typing what appeared to be a fundraising email, was that Jasmine Crockett had spent the previous 72 hours in a windowless conference room in the Rayburn building with 4 lawyers from the Congressional Research Service, 2 former federal prosecutors, and a banker's box containing 847 pages of documents that would dismantle every assumption he had just made about who was prepared for this hearing and who was not. Crockett entered the committee room at 9:52 a.m. carrying a single leather portfolio, navy blue, worn at the corners in a way that suggested years of courtroom use rather than recent purchase for the cameras. She wore a charcoal suit with no jewelry except a small pin on her lapel, the scales of justice, gold against black enamel. She did not look at Hawley as she took her seat at the witness table. She did not acknowledge the smirk that was still faintly visible on his face as he watched her arrange her materials. She simply opened the portfolio, removed a single sheet of paper, placed it face down on the table in front of her, and folded her hands. The posture of a trial attorney who has cross-examined hostile witnesses for a living and knows that the first rule of the courtroom is never to reveal your hand before the other side has committed to their story. The committee chair gavelled the hearing to order and invited Representative Crockett to deliver her opening statement. She thanked him. Her voice was measured, professional, carrying none of the rhetorical flourishes or emotional appeals that typically characterize congressional testimony. She began with a simple factual proposition: that the Senate's constitutional duty to provide advice and consent on judicial nominations required senators to base their votes on the actual qualifications and records of nominees rather than partisan loyalty or political expediency. Uncontroversial. Textbook. The kind of statement that appears in every civics class and is ignored in every confirmation hearing. Hawley was still on his phone. He had heard this argument before. He would hear it again. It meant nothing to him because it assumed he cared about constitutional norms more than he cared about winning. He did not look up. Crockett continued. She noted that in the previous congressional session, Senator Hawley had voted to confirm 43 federal judges nominated by the previous administration. She cited the number calmly, as a simple matter of public record. 43 judges. She paused. Hawley still wasn't looking up, but something in his posture had shifted slightly. The pause had been just long enough to suggest that the number mattered, that it was leading somewhere, but Crockett did not explain where. She simply moved to her next point. She observed that in every single one of those 43 confirmation votes, Senator Hawley had argued that the Senate must defer to the president's choice of qualified nominees, that partisan obstruction of the judicial confirmation process was a threat to constitutional order, and that senators who opposed well-credentialed judges for political reasons were abdicating their constitutional responsibility. She quoted him directly from the congressional record. His own words, preserved in the official transcript, impossible to deny or dismiss as taken out of context. The American people elected a president. That president has the constitutional authority to nominate judges. Our job is to confirm qualified nominees, not to play political games. Those were his words, from a floor speech he delivered on March 14, 2019. The quote sat in the air of the committee room like a piece of evidence placed on a table, waiting for someone to explain it. Hawley finally looked up from his phone. For the first time since Crockett had begun speaking, he was paying attention. Not worried yet, but paying attention. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, the posture of a man preparing to deploy a rebuttal he had used successfully many times before. The assumption was clear. She was about to accuse him of hypocrisy for opposing judges now, and he would respond that circumstances had changed, that the current nominees were different, that she was playing partisan games while he was defending constitutional principles. He had given that speech before. He would give it again. It always worked. Crockett turned the single page face up on the table. She did not hold it up to the camera. She did not read from it dramatically. She simply glanced at it, as if confirming something she had already memorized, and then looked directly at Senator Hawley for the first time since entering the room. Her expression had not changed. Calm, professional, almost gentle. What she said next was delivered in the tone of a professor asking a student to explain their own essay. Senator Hawley, you have opposed every single judicial nominee put forward by the current administration. All 41 nominees who have come before this committee in the past 18 months. You have voted no on district court judges, circuit court judges, and Supreme Court nominees. You have voted no on judges with unanimous American Bar Association ratings. You have voted no on judges who clerked for conservative justices. You have voted no on judges with prosecutorial experience, judges with decades on the bench, and judges who were previously confirmed to lower courts with your own support. 41 nominees. 41 no votes. I have the roll call records here if you would like to review them. She tapped the page in front of her once with her index finger. The gesture was small but impossibly precise, the kind of movement that communicates absolute certainty. Hawley's arms were still folded, but his jaw had tightened. He knew where this was going now. He knew she was about to call him a hypocrite, and he was already preparing his response. That the nominees had changed, that judicial philosophy mattered, that he was defending originalism against activist judges. He had the talking points memorized. He would deploy them in approximately 15 seconds. Crockett did not give him 15 seconds. She continued in the same measured tone, as if she were simply reading through a particularly interesting document rather than constructing a prosecutorial case. She noted that of the 43 judges Senator Hawley had supported in the previous administration, 19 had received split ratings from the American Bar Association, with several rated as not qualified. She noted that 12 had never served as judges before their lifetime appointments to the federal bench. She noted that 7 had been rated by the Nonpartisan Alliance for Justice as having troubling records on civil rights, voting rights, or reproductive freedom. She noted that 1 had written a law review article arguing that Brown v.'s Board of Education was wrongly decided. Senator Hawley had voted yes on all of them. She had their names, their confirmation dates, and their vote totals. She offered to enter the full list into the committee record. The room had gone quiet in the way that hearing rooms go quiet when everyone present realizes they are watching something unravel in real time. The typing in the press gallery had stopped. The senators who had been whispering to their aides were now watching Crockett, and Josh Hawley's face had changed color, not dramatically, but the cameras caught it. The confident pink of a man who believed he controlled the room had shifted to something harder, redder, the physical response of someone whose body understands what is happening before their conscious mind has fully processed the threat. Crockett had not raised her voice. She had not accused him of anything. She had simply placed 2 sets of facts next to each other and allowed the committee to observe the shape they made when aligned. 43 yes votes for judges with questionable qualifications when his party held the presidency. 41 no votes for judges with sterling qualifications when the other party held the presidency. The conclusion was so obvious that stating it explicitly would have been redundant, and so she did not state it. She simply let the numbers sit. Hawley uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward to his microphone, the movement slightly too fast, slightly too aggressive, the physical tell of a man who has been caught in something and needs to regain control of the narrative immediately. He began to speak, his voice carrying the edge of someone who has been insulted and is about to correct a fundamental misunderstanding. He said that the representative from Texas was playing a partisan game, that she was cherry-picking numbers without context, that judicial philosophy was what mattered in confirmation votes, not credentials on paper. He said that he had always based his votes on whether nominees would interpret the Constitution as written or legislate from the bench. He said that her insinuation of hypocrisy was offensive and beneath the dignity of this committee. It was a strong response. It would have worked in most settings. It was designed to reframe the conversation from his voting record to her tactics, to make the issue her unfair attack rather than his documented pattern. He delivered it with the vocal intensity of a man who had won many arguments by simply refusing to concede ground. When he finished, he sat back in his chair with visible satisfaction, as if the matter were now settled. Crockett waited until he was completely finished. She waited 1 additional second. Then she reached into her portfolio and removed a second document. This one was thicker, stapled. She placed it on the table with the same deliberate gentleness she had used for the first page, as if she were handling something fragile and important. She looked at it for a moment, then looked back up at Senator Hawley. "Senator Hawley," she said, her tone unchanged from the beginning of her testimony, "could you explain to this committee how judicial philosophy factors into the confirmation of a district court judge whose primary responsibility is to apply existing Supreme Court precedent and federal statutes to individual cases rather than to set constitutional policy?" The question was delivered without inflection, without sarcasm, without any hint that it was anything other than a genuine request for clarification. But everyone in the room understood immediately that it was not a question seeking information. It was a question designed to expose that the justification Hawley had just offered made no sense in the context of district court confirmations, which comprised the majority of the votes she had cited. Hawley opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his notes. The silence that followed was not long by objective measurement, 7 seconds. But 7 seconds of a United States senator searching for an answer to a simple procedural question felt like an eternity in a committee hearing. When he finally spoke, his response was that all judges, regardless of level, brought a judicial philosophy to their work, and that philosophy mattered in every appointment. It was not a good answer. It was the kind of answer a law student gives when they have not read the case and are trying to fill time until the professor moves on to someone else. Crockett did not move on. She noted, still in that same calm voice, that Senator Hawley himself had argued during the previous administration that district court judges should be confirmed based primarily on their legal credentials, courtroom experience, and ratings from the Bar Association rather than on broad ideological grounds, because district judges do not set policy. She quoted him again, from a 2018 committee hearing. "We are not here to conduct ideological purity tests on judges who will spend their careers applying the law as written. We are here to confirm qualified lawyers to fill vacancies in our federal courts." His words. The congressional record never forgets. Hawley's face was now unmistakably red. He interrupted before she could continue. He said that she was twisting his words, that context mattered, that he had always been consistent in his judicial philosophy. His voice had risen, not to a shout, but to the elevated volume of someone who is used to dominating a conversation through force of presence and is discovering that force is not working. He demanded to know whether she was accusing him of lying to the committee. Crockett did not take the bait. She did not raise her voice to match his. She did not accuse him of lying. She simply said, in exactly the same tone she had maintained since walking into the room, "Senator Hawley, I am not accusing you of anything. I am asking you to explain your voting record using the standards you yourself articulated. If judicial philosophy is the basis for your opposition to current nominees, could you explain why it was not the basis for your support of previous nominees who had substantially weaker credentials?" She paused. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Or if credentials are the basis for your votes, could you explain why you are opposing nominees with perfect ABA ratings while you supported nominees who were rated not qualified?" It was not a trap. It was 2 traps. There was no answer that would not require him to either admit that his previous statements had been insincere or that his current positions were indefensible. Either his past self had lied about what mattered in judicial confirmations, or his present self was lying now. The shape of the contradiction was so clear that trying to argue around it would only make it more visible. The silence that followed was longer than the first one. 10 seconds. 15. 20. The typing in the press gallery had resumed, but every journalist in the room was documenting the same thing. The exact length of time a sitting United States senator sat unable to answer a simple question about his own voting record. Hawley's hands were gripping the edge of the table in front of him. His jaw was working as if he were trying to form words that would not come. Someone in the back of the room coughed, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Finally, Hawley said that he stood by every vote he had ever cast and that he would not be lectured on constitutional principles by a junior member of the House who had been in Congress for less than 2 years. It was a personal attack disguised as a defense of institutional dignity. It was the last move available to someone who has lost the argument and needs to disqualify the person asking the questions. Crockett absorbed the insult without any visible reaction. She did not defend her credentials. She did not point out that she had been a civil rights attorney for a decade before running for Congress. She did not mention that she had argued cases before federal courts that Senator Hawley had never set foot in. She simply reached into her portfolio one more time and removed a thin folder. Red, marked with a single white label that read in typed letters, Senate Judiciary Committee, Confirmation Statements 2017 to 2024. She opened it. She did not read from it immediately. She let it sit there, open on the table, its contents visible to the cameras but not yet quoted. The visual presence of the folder was its own form of evidence. It communicated that everything she had said so far was documented, that she had not come to this hearing with talking points, that somewhere in that folder were the receipts for every claim she had made, and that she had more. Senator Hawley, Crockett said, looking directly at him now with an expression that was not quite sympathy but something close to it. Do you believe the Senate has a constitutional obligation to evaluate judicial nominees based on their qualifications rather than partisan loyalty? It was the simplest possible question. It was a question to which there was only one acceptable answer in a committee hearing on judicial nominations. Yes. Of course the Senate should base confirmations on qualifications. To say anything else would be to admit that the entire confirmation process was a sham. But to say yes was to condemn his own voting record using his own stated principles. He was cornered by his past self. Hawley did not answer immediately. He looked at the folder on the table. He looked at Crockett's face. He looked at the chairman of the committee as if hoping for an intervention that did not come. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been at any point in the hearing. He said that the Senate's constitutional role was more complex than that question suggested, and that he would not be cornered into oversimplifying a nuanced constitutional process. It was not an answer. It was an admission that he could not answer without destroying his position. And everyone in the room knew it. Crockett did not press him. She did not point out that he had failed to answer. She simply closed the red folder, placed it back in her portfolio, and delivered her final statement. She said that the American people deserved a judicial confirmation process based on transparent principles consistently applied. That when a senator voted one way for 43 judges and the opposite way for 41 judges with superior qualifications, the public was entitled to know whether the determining factor was the judge's credentials or the party of the president who nominated them. That this was not a partisan question. It was a question of institutional integrity, and that she hoped this committee would hold all of its members to the same standards they claimed to value. She thanked the committee for their time. She gathered her portfolio. She stood, and as she walked toward the exit, Josh Hawley sat motionless in his chair, his face still red, his hands still gripping the table, staring at the space where the red folder had been. He did not ask any follow-up questions. He did not attempt a rebuttal. The cameras captured him in perfect stillness for 11 seconds before he abruptly stood, ripped his nameplate from its holder with enough force that it clattered against the microphone, and walked out of the committee room without excusing himself. The hearing continued without him. The clip of the 23-second silence went viral within 90 minutes. Not because of anything Crockett had said, but because of what Hawley had not said. Because a man who had built a political career on projecting absolute certainty, who had made his name by never conceding ground in any argument, had been asked a simple question about his own voting record and had no answer that would not destroy him. And because he had begun the hearing with a smirk that communicated his absolute confidence that the woman about to testify had nothing of value to say. At the start of the hearing, Senator Hawley had looked at Jasmine Crockett and smiled the smile of a man who believed she did not belong in his room. By the end of the hearing, he had walked out of that same room because he could not defend his presence in it. The reversal was complete. The smirk had become the evidence, and the woman he had dismissed without a word had dismantled his credibility without raising her voice. She had not needed to. She had simply needed him to speak first, to commit to a position, to establish what he believed the rules should be. And then she had held him to those rules, using his own words as the measuring stick. That was not a political strategy. That was a courtroom strategy. And Josh Hawley had walked into her courtroom, carrying nothing but confidence that his institutional authority would be enough. It was not enough. It had never been enough. The evidence had always mattered more than the smirk. She had known that from the beginning. He had learned it 23 seconds too late.